Okay, this is The Grass is Greener on WXRW 104.1 FM in Milwaukee. I am the host of the program, Gary Grass. With me is my co-host, Babette Grineau.
Hi, and today we are going to talk about the Venezuelan elections. Alison Bodine is a social justice and anti-war activist and author based in Vancouver, Canada. She is on the board of the editorial board of the Fire This Time newspaper and coordinator of the Fire This Time Venezuela Solidarity campaign and a founding member of the Venezuela Solidarity Network. She has been in international elections, observing them on 3 different occasions, including the most recent 2024 presidential election in Venezuela. Her book is Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Venezuela, Battle of Ideas Press. Welcome, Alison Bodine.
Thank you very much, Gary and Babette. It's a pleasure to be here on The Grass is Greener.
Oh, it's great to have you. Why don't we just start with a general rundown for people who haven't been following this? I know when things first came out, there was like a lot of stuff all over Twitter about things burning everywhere in Venezuela, and it really seemed rough for a time, and there's been a lot of kind of like back and forth, and just sort of tell us what happened here.
So Venezuela held their constitutionally mandated presidential elections on July 28th of this year. The election process happened as per their constitution, as per their laws around elections on that day, which is a Sunday. And the results were announced at around midnight by something called the National Electoral Council. So I just want to really emphasize that Venezuela is well practiced and Venezuelans are well versed and empowered by their participatory democracy model, which includes voting in elections such as a presidential election. Not only did the election take place on the 28th, but actually they hold kind of a practice election where Venezuelans are encouraged to go out and vote, to walk through the steps, to actually use the machinery to test it in a few weeks before the election so that they're sure everything will go smoothly. And it really did go smoothly. I was one of over 900 elections observers that was on the ground in Venezuela alongside 1,300 accredited journalists. And we had been in Venezuela a number of days prior to the election in order to learn about the process, to get updated about the reality of Venezuela today, including Venezuela's fight against U.S.-backed sanctions and blockade against their country, and then to be able to observe the actual voting and polling stations on the ground on Sunday, the 28th. And unfortunately, the violence that happened and started about 12 hours after the election's results were announced, and the opposition saying that they did not recognize the results of the elections and in fact declaring that their candidate Edmundo Gonzalez had won the election, not President Nicolas Maduro, as the National Electoral Council in Venezuela had announced. Their reaction was also completely predictable and actually planned ahead of time, really pre-orchestrated. And that's not just me saying that or elections observers or, Venezuelans saying that. In fact, the opposition of Edmundo Gonzalez, who was kind of the stand-in candidate in place of a more well-known politician, Marina Corina Machado, who was not allowed to run in the election because of her treasonous acts against the country of Venezuela. She and Edmundo had refused to sign an agreement before the election saying that they would recognize the election results. So their non-recognition of the election results was of absolutely no surprise. What was unfortunate and unnecessary and really, I think, was, pushed by the U.S. media, especially and right-wing media in Venezuela, was the violence that happened afterwards. That included attacks on Venezuela's public institutions and especially, although they were isolated incidents, it really seemed like a coordinated response. Like the opposition said, we don't recognize the results, and activated some various gangs across the country to commit these acts against public institutions or, things like tearing down statues of indigenous resistance fighters. So
and
all
some
of
people
that
were
did
killed
happen.
in this whole process too. I mean, there were a couple of very strong Chavista organizers that were murdered in this whole campaign.
Very true. Yeah. So although I don't want to take it lightly, I will say that the media, especially in North America, definitely overblew that Venezuela was on any state of, crisis or imminent collapse. The majority of Venezuela continued to be in a state of calm. People recognized the election results and the victory of President Maduro as announced by the National Electoral Council, and they eagerly awaited the final results, of which Venezuela has about 30 days to announce, or not about, they have exactly within 30 days, they have to announce those results. Too detailed. But it's very true. People were killed. Actually, they say now the statistics are, I believe, 25 people lost their lives, including, yes, Chavista supporters and, just bystanders that were on the street, including young people. And it is really the result of U.S.-backed support for this right-wing force in Venezuela and this opposition, and their fomenting of trying to create chaos in Venezuela, trying to bring about a coup and a reversal of the Bolivarian revolutionary process, which has been taking place in Venezuela since 1998. So, we didn't see, I did not directly see any of that violence on the ground, but definitely heard from my friends and colleagues and co-fighters in Venezuela about what they were experiencing in their neighborhoods, people staying at home, not wanting to go out, on the lookout for their neighbors, trying to see if any more violence was going to be fomented. And we actually had a bus of international observers was on their way to the airport the day following the election. And a right-wing gang essentially started a fire in the middle of the highway on the way to the airport. And that bus did turn around, as well as a hotel that contained, the hotel that contained a number of the international observers that were invited by the National Electoral Council, which is called the CNE in Venezuela. Their hotel was also directly attacked with smoke bombs by a gang of thugs that were mostly, unfortunately, young people. And now we've learned from Venezuela's attorney general that many of these people were paid in order to carry out these violent acts. And we know the direction and the kind of political allegiance of these violent acts because they, as you've said, targeted Chavistas, which in Venezuela often means targeted people of color or people even wearing the color red. We saw a repeat of violence that's been taking place in the country with the support of the United States government that resulted in the death, for example, of Orlando Figueroa in 2015. He was lit on fire just for being a person of color and wearing red. Targeted as a Chavista. And so this is completely unacceptable that the U.S. government has somehow painted this as a pro-democracy opposition when really what they are is a violent, destabilizing opposition that is attempting to overthrow the government and to discourage people from supporting President Nicolas Maduro, which they did during this 2024 presidential election.
Okay, there's a lot to go into there. I'd like to roll it back a little bit first and talk about the elections and the immediate follow up to the actual voting, because you were on the ground and saw a very free and fair process while it was taking place, but there were certain warning signs that were sort of used to promote this narrative of stolen elections. There, normally the CNE website is up 24 hours and they're constantly streaming in the votes, and you have this fairly prompt, very detailed information that comes out because everything is electronic. I mean, it's air-gapped from the internet, but it's all handled electronically with all these paper backups for everything. And it's all just this very sophisticated system, and you're used to seeing very quick results. But in this case, the CNE website went down. There was a delay in the reporting of the results. The government said they had been the subject of some sort of cyber attack. And so, I mean, and then you have this gap where there wasn't official detailed information coming out, and the other side went and printed out, put up online all these different ballot receipts and tallies that claim to show that, oh look, we won, we had 85% of the vote or whatever. And there were polls beforehand that said that too. So you have this whole narrative that springs up that says, oh, the CNE is lying, Maduro controls the whole electoral machinery. This is what really happened. And so I'd like to kind of address that narrative and talk about how some of that came about.
I would mention that I think some of the polls, I questioned some of the polls, whether they were actually before or as people were coming out and where the polls were taken, because that in a country that is so has such a big gap in economic and political
so stratified.
Yeah.
Right.
That it would matter a lot where those polls were taken.
Definitely. And a lot of these results from these polls come with very little data backing them up about, where the polls were taken, how many people were asked, all of that. So I think that's an important point to always make, Babette. But kind of to the bigger picture, I would say that it fits into the narrative that I mentioned before. It already kind of been weaved, through the U.S. government. I mean, ultimately, I would say has set itself up to be the arbiter of elections in Venezuela. They've said that we are the voice of what, is a free and fair election in Venezuela. And if Maduro wins, it's not free and fair. And I think we can see that by following State Department statements that have been made prior to the election for up to a year, all the way into the actual election day. And the U.S. even, claiming that they, for example, brought about the presidential election through the Barbados agreements. I mean, like I mentioned at the beginning, this election took place as per Venezuela's constitution, where the president is elected on a regular schedule. And so nothing irregular really happened there, but the U.S. tried to claim
the U.S. kept trying to push them to break that schedule and have an election sooner.
Exactly, right? And then they claim democracy. So we have to have that critical mind when we examine, of course, why the U.S. ever gets the right to be an arbiter, not only looking at presidential elections in the United States and how frequently those have been challenged in court or how long the results have taken. So if we have that lens and we want to go into some of the details, I would say that also in Venezuela's election history, this was the 32nd election in 25 years, of which the opposition has won twice. They won the National Assembly a majority in 2015, and they won a referendum, defeated essentially a referendum a number of years before. And both of those times, of course, there was no cry of fraud. But every time since then that Chavistas have won the election, there's been this narrative of fraud with no final proof offered, where they've just been able to say it. And I think that's very similar.
We would never see anything like that in the United States.
Right? Except that this election and, and the kind of the world that we live in today means, like just what you said, the opposition could upload to a website. No one verifies this website. No one's checked that none of those files have been manipulated, but they can make this website and say, well, this is the facts. This is what we produced, even though, I think critical minded people today would say, isn't it kind of easy to forge documents? Like, we all know that this sort of lying and manipulation happens, but sometimes when something gets put up online, suddenly it's like, oh, well, that's the real result, because it already fits so well into the narrative that's been pushed into your brain, essentially, that Venezuela is a dictatorship. There's no way Maduro would win the popular vote. And so it's just confirmation bias that you believe this website. So it's true. The website went up and it claimed to show the results. The CNE said that there was trouble with the transmission. Venezuela, one part of Venezuela's participatory democracy that I want to make really clear that came with the Bolivarian revolutionary process is that before 1998 and the election of Hugo Chavez and the rewriting of Venezuela's constitution, voting wasn't accessible to the majority of Venezuelans. the voting centers were only in middle class or rich neighborhoods. You had to have an identification card and you had to be literate in order to vote. And Venezuela had high illiteracy. After the Bolivarian revolutionary process began, one of the first things they did was work to implement Cuba's literacy program for adult literacy and eliminate illiteracy in Venezuela, get everyone an ID card in the remote areas of Venezuela. And now voting is something that is accessible to everyone. And we saw that on the ground in this election and heard it from people living, in remote areas. So some of these machines, as you described, Venezuela has an electronic ballot that is backed up by a paper ballot. Some of these machines are in very, distant areas from the center of city. And there's a high level of cyber protection as far as how the results are eventually transmitted. And then eventually the paper ballots can be received and audits are conducted. But the transmission is what the CNE said. There was
they even have regular instant audits throughout the process. I mean,
they do. Yeah. 54% of the machines are pretty immediately audited, is my understanding. And then there's 16 steps of audit and transparency as far as who can have information based on these machines. So it's not irregular that the opposition candidates are saying, well, we have the printouts, because they are allowed to have the printouts. The opposition party can have witnesses, any of the opposition parties can have witnesses and are supposed to, if they have a witness, to sign off on the final results from each polling station. So the fact that they published some of these actas, they call them, or tallies, I think is a great translation for that process. It's not weird that they have them, but that they published them. It's not their job to do that, really. And so what the National Electoral Council did was, announce the results once they felt like they had a strong enough trend. They announced that Maduro had won 51.2% of the vote, and the Edmundo Gonzalez had won around 44%. And then there were 8 other candidates actually in this election that made up the rest of the votes. And so after that happened, the CNE then continues through a number of audit processes until they can publish the 100% results. And in previous elections, they have also taken a few days to get all the information together and to release the precinct level, I think is what they're calling it in U.S. media, or like the, electoral voting center level of votes. But Maduro pretty quickly saw what was happening, saw these allegations of fraud, and essentially called the bluff of the opposition and said, if you have data, the onus is on you to prove fraud, because Venezuela's already, proven we have a great electoral system that functions well and that produces auditable, verifiable results that the Venezuelan people believe in. And he took the case to the Supreme Court. So over the last week or so, the Supreme Court has subpoenaed all of the opposition leaders, told them to come, bring your actas, bring the tallies that you have, submit them to the court, and the court will review everything and make a decision. Now, of course, the U.S. media is really trying to dismiss this, or painting it as the Venezuelan government controls the Supreme Court, so we can't.
The real Supreme Court is the one in Miami.
Exactly, but the same process happened with the Trump so-called contested election. I mean, it's normal for countries to go through this sort of Supreme Court verification when it's necessary. And so I think that's also something that needs to be respected by the United States.
Candidates brought their tallies, right? And
they did, yeah. So everyone presented their tallies, including including President Maduro.
Except for Gonzalez, right?
Exactly. Except for Edmundo Gonzalez, he refused, essentially published a letter, I think, online saying, we can't trust this and we're not going to do it. So they're in violation of the court, and they have not presented their results. And the Venezuelan authorities are going through, and have access to the online tallies that were published. And I don't know if that will be considered in the Supreme Court. But definitely the Edmundo Gonzalez has boycotted the Supreme Court process, and, we'll wait for that determination. But I also think that it's important to mention that Venezuelans, I also went to Venezuela during the 2021 governor's election. And during that election, in which a few opposition members did win governorships, the same thing happened. Oh, this is fraud. The PSUV and the party of President Nicolas Maduro and the Bolivarian Revolution could not have won this many governorships. There was fraud. And really important quote I wanted to bring into this is just that a Venezuelan analyst said, well, even if the government produced all of their tallies, released all the information, was fully transparent, made it public, which, perhaps they will eventually decide to do, even if it's outside their laws, they may decide to do it. But even if they do, this actually isn't really a legal question. The U.S. government is just, and the opposition, it's just a facade that they say this is about any sort of legality. This is a political question. And so no matter what Venezuela does to try and fulfill, the government does to try and fulfill the demands of the U.S. or somehow, recognize that the U.S. even has jurisdiction to demand things, there's always going to be another reason, because it's actually about overthrowing the government and creating discontent in Venezuela, not about any sort of legal question.
Yeah, I kind of see this pattern from the beginning. You have the website of the Electoral Council going down, and it's like, well, you remember there were these types of attacks before. The electrical grid failed in Caracas, a few years ago, and the government said, well, they were being attacked by the United States. That's what happened, right? And I don't know if that was ever decided whether or not that was really what happened or not, but the U.S. has those capacities to do that. It wasn't ridiculous or unbelievable for the government to say that. And now they're kind of at least casting suspicion that the same thing happened here with the Electoral Council website. And then you have the slow vote, right? And it's like, that is being attributed to a cyber attack as well, which is, again, analysts have looked at that and said, well, that's very feasible. We don't know for certain, but that could certainly be the case. But we saw something similar in Bolivia, right, where the vote was slowed, and that was used as an excuse to accuse the government of fraud and say, well, look, we can't trust these results. And what it was just, slow votes coming back from rural areas. It's like, this is very, very normal type of shift. Oh, look, the vote swings one way as the votes start to come from different regions. It's like, that's very normal. That happens in every U.S. election. But when it happened in Bolivia, everyone was kind of jumping up and down looking for excuses to say Morales didn't win that election. So we've seen these kind of same patterns before. And then so, I think the whole idea was, you create a situation where you can cast doubt on the election. Then you have some violence, which you can blow up in the media to make it look like the country is falling apart. And you hope that sort of image gets transferred into reality, and you have some excuse to intervene, or, you can send some sort of emergency assistance down there, and it becomes like a much bigger thing. So I think that was sort of the plot from the beginning. I don't know if you have a comment on that.
No, I agree. And the night after the election, so the night of the election, I want to emphasize at 12 midnight, the results were announced. Myself and a number of international observers, along with Venezuelans, of every, stripe. There was no screening process besides a simple look through people's bags to check for weapons or alcohol. Everyone was allowed into the space at Miraflores Palace in order to await the election's results. So myself, alongside thousands of other people, were waiting for those election results that night. And they came. We got to see the reaction of Venezuelans that were there. We were in a Chavista crowd, so everyone was very excited about the election results. And then we took a number of hours to get back to our hotels where we were staying, and there was complete peace in the streets. There was, after that initial celebration, Venezuela has a dry election for 3 days, 2 days prior to the election, and the day following, there's no sales of alcohol. You're not supposed to be consuming alcohol in public places.
Aww.
So there was,
I'm not a drinker myself, but I just imagine this big party in Venezuela during the elections.
Yeah. They vote with a lot of celebration and dance. I would say we saw, some dance performances, keeping folks entertained as they waited in line to vote in Venezuela. But
Boom
there
boxes,
was,
but no rum.
Right. But there was, that night, like it was calm. It was like, these are the results of the elections. We accept them. And truthfully, if you look at the percentages of votes in favor of President Nicolas Maduro and the Chavistas, numbers statistically very much in line with the 2018 presidential election, which the opposition completely boycotted on orders from the United States government. So nothing was overly surprising about the elections results, especially to people that had also voted, or us as observers, talking to people in lines. We were not shocked at all by the results. And the day went on as normal. And it wasn't until about the middle of the day of the Monday following the election that we started seeing these reports and of violence occurring. And it really did feel like this attack is coming from outside. People started circulating videos that have now been identified as coming from other countries. One of helicopters in Turkey attacking protesters. This was not Venezuela, but the damage is often already done when videos like that get circulated and even when the corrections are made. And so I think that kind of attempt to foment more violence by convincing others that this is a mass movement of anti-government violence was tried. Venezuela, the next day, did announce that this was an attempted coup. There was an attempted coup underway, and they called Chavistas to the street. And that is the majority of people that we have seen silenced in U.S. media. What we completely do not see on the news are the protests, mass protests, millions of people actually across the country defending Venezuela for days on end. They had protests of the women's movement came out and protest one day. They had elders come out and protest another day. The workers movement came out in support of the vote and Venezuela's sovereignty, self-determination, independence, their right to not follow the dictate of the United States. That's what folks were demonstrating for. They were demonstrating in defense of their vote, of their democratic and participatory election, and against the violence that had been happening. And we didn't see any of those mobilizations in Western media at all. We saw some doctored photos. Yeah, we saw some doctored photos of supposedly large demonstrations of the opposition, but we didn't see the mass Chavista rallies. There was never, the media didn't ever make that contrast, and they couldn't because they'd see there was overwhelming support for the government. That doesn't mean that there was zero people at the opposition rally. As Babette was saying, like the country is polarized in some ways. There is opposition, and Edmundo Gonzalez got something like 4 million votes. Like the opposition got votes, but they did not win, and they are not the majority. And that's how Venezuela works. And that's supposedly what the United States also supports when they say that they support democracy. The majority got their win and should be recognized as such in any sense of the word, in defense of Venezuela's, sovereignty and self-determination and against the U.S.'s right to intervene. And I would say also that the U.S. didn't just intervene that night for this coup attempt, which, as I said, was defeated by the mobilization of people in the streets, of Venezuelan people in the streets in support of their vote and their government. But it was also already intervening in Venezuela. We cannot say that that this election took place without U.S. intervention, because they'd imposed sanctions and other forms of, psychological warfare against the people of Venezuela for years before the election, and then including the election this year. So these elections are taking place when Venezuela is in a form of a state of war. Sanctions are a form of war, and the vote took place during U.S. sanctions.
Well, I want to know just the effects of the sanctions, because I understand that they've had quite a destructive effect on the economy, and also led to some people's deaths, right? Yeah,
more than just a few. The U.S. government has weaponized sanctions against over a third of the world at this point, and we've seen the devastating impacts of those sanctions, over 60 years of blockade on Cuba, sanctions continuing against the people of Iran, sanctions against Syria. All sorts of countries around the world are under the brunt of sanctions. And in Venezuela, the impact has also been equally devastating. Venezuela's sanctions really began most strongly in 2015 when the U.S. government declared that Venezuela was an extraordinary threat to U.S. national security. And this gave them, under the Obama administration, the justification that they needed, the legal framework that they needed in order to implement sanctions, financial sanctions, and also sanctions specifically, eventually targeting Venezuela's oil sector. So Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves and has relied for 100 years and more on the production of oil in order to fuel their economy. Of course, for years before Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian revolutionary process, a lot of this money, the majority of it, went to line the pockets of international oil corporations and Venezuela's wealthiest class. But under Hugo Chavez, it was also the money in the Bolivarian revolutionary process. It was also money used to fund social programs and the massive changes that were taking place in the country to put the needs of people before that of profit and invest in communities. And so the sanctions against Venezuela in their first the oil sanctions in particular, in their first year alone, took the lives of at least 40,000 people. Alfred de Zayas from the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights has written reports saying at least 100,000 people during a similar period, people dying because of lack of access to food, medicine, basic goods, because Venezuela could no longer operate normally on the international financial market and had its oil sector frozen. They'd lost about 90% of their GDP at one point. So that is a clearly devastating attack that impacted every single person in Venezuela. And that was not that long ago. 2018, 2019, they were experiencing an extreme lack of revenue that the state was used to operating with, and had to really refigure their economy and come up with ways to fight the sanctions, to ally with other sanctioned countries to get around this brutal U.S. attack. And there has been a fair bit of recovery, but Venezuela can still not operate normally on any market. You know, they can't still have access to all of their funds. They've had money frozen in European banks. The Bank of England is holding on to $2 billion of Venezuela's gold that they refused to turn over to Venezuela. They have money frozen when they try and do something as simple as buy vaccines or cancer medications from Europe. And so the situation is still very difficult and very irregular despite the recovery. And the U.S. government knows exactly what they're doing, trying to strangle the economy, to push the Venezuelan people into submission, into overthrowing their democratically elected government.
Yeah, I mean, I want to talk more about some of those too. But I just to note, I mean, you know, it's not like any accusation of a coup is coming out of the blue here. I mean, we've had several attempted coups in Venezuela, which the U.S. has, you know, acknowledged, right? You've had John Bolton bragging about the coups he's been part of. You've had, you know, other people in the United States government saying we were tried to coup this, we tried to coup that, and it's like, you know, there have been a series of these, you know, back from when Chavez was president, back through the little Bay of Piglets, where they sent these little mercenaries onto the beach and they all got rounded up and captured in a day. And this whole bizarre process where, you know, Mike Pence gives a call into Venezuela and says to Juan Guaido that he's now president. And then they run around parading him around like he's the actual president of Venezuela for a few years. And I guess, you know, I guess they finally cut him loose and to get to recognize this new guy. But it's like, I mean, that was such a joke and seemed that way for most of the world. And I guess, you know, the plan was to make Gonzalez into Guaido 2.0.
Yeah, we definitely just watched that happen in action. And, you know, I agree that to most of the world, this was yet another farcity of the United States, really showed the U.S.'s isolated position when they claim, oh, the whole world recognizes Guaido or the whole world stands with us in these sanctions. when you actually look at a map, you see the reality. It's countries like the United States, Canada, and the European Union, again, hand in hand in their wars and interventions against other countries. And it's not the voice of the majority.
I want to point this out, too. If you actually look it up, the European Union had a very ambiguous statement where they recognized the sovereignty of the Venezuelan Assembly. And then when the Venezuelan Assembly dropped Guaido, they were just kind of like, okay, well, it doesn't matter because we've actually been dealing day to day with Maduro anyway. I mean, Europe's whole following along with this recognition of Guaido was always kind of like never really completely true anyway. I mean, it really was just so much of the world just didn't pay any of this seriously at all.
Yeah, and how could it be? The actual, president is in Venezuela, has support of the majority, and still, the government is operating as a normal government with control of their financial resources. I mean, Europe could, as you said, make all the deals they want with Guaido, but he controlled 0 institutions in Venezuela and had no base of support in people. So it's a dead end, although a massive political game. I do want to say that it did cost the people of Venezuela billions of dollars, because the U.S. government, what they did do was take Venezuelan assets that were in the United States that they frozen and refused to hand over to the government of the U.S., and they handed them to Guaido. So Guaido's come out of the whole thing quite wealthy. And, it's true he's been dropped, but he'll be sitting pretty for the rest of his life.
Yeah, they gave him access to all the money he wanted to steal, and now he's running around the university circuit giving little talks like he knows anything. This is a guy that was like selling electronics out of the back of a van before they put him in the National Assembly. I mean, it's just an incredibly unimpressive figure. When you were talking about the rallies that the opposition had and saying that they were fairly small, I think that's a matter of perspective. I think, for some people in the United States, if you saw pictures of some of the, rallies where, Corina Machado and Gonzalez were showing up, I think you'd say some of those looked like pretty big rallies. They were nothing in comparison to the size of the Chavista rallies. But they looked really impressive compared to some of the stuff, where Guaido is meeting and, he gets like 100 people and they have to bring the cameras in really, really close to make it look like someone showed up. In the end there, the opposition was so divided, they were throwing Guaido under the bus, and he was going out places and people were throwing chairs at him. There was a lot of very funny spectacle around Guaido, but the problem is, as you say, it allowed the U.S. to use him to essentially seize Citgo, worth billions of dollars, and basically what happened is all these oil companies sued Citgo. Guaido, being formally in charge of the Venezuelan government recognized by the United States, said, okay, we're going to have this guy who basically is in cahoots with the other side be our lawyer. And, they just throw the case, and now Citgo is being dismantled and all the assets being stripped off and sold to U.S. corporations. And, I think they just want to keep, I think we have a lot of interest, the United States has a lot of interest in wanting to suppress Venezuelan democracy. But, part of it is just, we have to keep someone in charge who can make sure that the stealing of Citgo goes smoothly.
Yeah, and we'll see how the U.S. government maneuvers over this next period when their coup has failed. Their opposition that they thought was the winning ticket this time did not succeed in taking the government or creating a mass movement in Venezuela in favor of the opposition and against the Bolivarian revolutionary process. And that all that credit, of course, goes to the people of Venezuela, 25 or more of whom have lost their lives in the past 10 days or so. But I did want to also say that if we want to switch to some talk about U.S. policy, it's interesting to watch as this goes down. So they're at a dead end for Guaido. They have this new strategy of supporting Machado. Again, she's been a stooge for the United States government for decades. It's no surprise who her real bosses are to anyone in Venezuela. And if you follow her political history, to anyone that takes the chance to review who she actually is. the U.S. government on August 2nd, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken actually had a phone call with Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez, because remember, Edmundo Gonzalez is the candidate, but Machado is the real candidate, and they have, they're a team. They don't go one without the other.
He's the sock puppet.
Yeah, I mean, she has to raise his arm up at the rallies. It's like he seems more out of it than Biden.
Yeah,
it's a weird parallel. We're seeing like the Weekend at Bernie's model in two countries at once.
So
we're exporting our form of democracy,
right? Yeah, in the form of puppets. So the Secretary of State, the report from the State Department on this conversation said that Blinken congratulated Edmundo Gonzalez for receiving the most votes in Venezuela's July 28th presidential election, as documented by the votes that essentially had been posted online. So apparently they had this conversation, and the U.S. government said that they recognized that Edmundo Gonzalez ran the most votes. But 3 days later, so after 3 days of this continued failed coup, after 3 days of Chavista mobilizations in the streets, people defending their self-determination, sovereignty, and their vote, the U.S. government gets asked at a State Department press conference, well, do you recognize Edmundo Gonzalez? And they said, no, that's not our position at this time. So they made these statements. They essentially reversed their position. They seemed very much in favor of, we're going to recognize Edmundo Gonzalez. As you said, this Guaido 2.0 will name a candidate that didn't win as the president. But they seem to have backtracked on that so far with this other State Department report from August 5th, the press conference. And I think that's a lot in response to the on-the-ground situation in Venezuela. And now the U.S. government is claiming that they are offering Maduro asylum and, his political so-called cohorts if he will step down from power and come to some sort of negotiated agreement. And that
did he offer the same back? Did he offer the same back? Did he offer the same back? Did he, as he said, well, I appreciate the offer, and if you ever want to seek asylum in Venezuela and give over your country, then please, feel welcome to come here.
I haven't seen that, but I do wish I would have. It would have been apt for sure. Yeah, so they're just, which is another farce internationally. I mean, if the government's continued functioning, they're moving beyond the violence, and there's no talk of any sort of negotiated agreement with the opposition regarding a peace. The people of Venezuela have brought their peace to the country. I hope that the U.S. has learned their lesson yet again and will respect the results of the presidential election and sovereignty and self-determination. We know that they are definitely planning their next steps, but I think that the people of Venezuela and the government of President Nicolas Maduro have thrown another, it's a thorn in their side. They've successfully defeated what this latest strategy was. So the U.S. is scrambling to figure out what's next. And I think that this will have, the U.S. will continue to have consequences in Venezuela, and their continued sanctions and blockade and all forms of attack, and, maybe these continued cyber attacks. But so far, Venezuelans have been holding up strong.
It reminds me, however, of an earlier coup, and that is in Chile, where bribes were offered if Allende would have stepped down, or bribes were offered to various military people, to General Schneider, who refused the bribe and was then assassinated. Bribes were offered to other military people, such as Pinochet, who took it apparently, and ended up as the head of the coup government. I do see, I don't know if there has been any offers to any of the military, but I do see the military seemingly behind Maduro, and that makes a big difference. If you have the military behind you, if you have, the government still acting as one, whereas if you just have popular support, which is all great, but you don't have the military support, you could easily be tossed out.
It's a very important point. A component of Venezuela's Bolivarian revolution has been the civic military alliance that you are exactly speaking to, in the ways that the military has stood with the Bolivarian revolution and stood with the government. Maria Corina Machado did issue an open statement and probably all sorts of private offers to military officials to stand. She essentially called on them to stand against President Maduro and to join the opposition. And that did not spark any sort of revolt or break in this civic military alliance. But I think that's definitely on the table for them to continue to try and implement. And just another reason why we have to remain vigilant and active in our defense of Venezuela's sovereignty and self-determination, and our demands on the U.S. government to end their sanctions and intervention and respect Venezuela's presidential election. And that comes to, this radio show and the importance of countering the mass media narrative about Venezuela, which I think is overwhelmingly still that this was somehow a fraudulent election without any backing or proof. And even if there's eventually, it's shown that there's fraud committed by the opposition, and in fact, that's not going to gain the same ground at all as these allegations have already gained in all across all major media, from CNN to the Washington Post to the New York Times. So we have to continue these sort of conversations, and I'm very, happy to be here and to continue talking about that, and also organizing in all sorts of ways. As I mentioned, I think that the people of Venezuela on the ground, the community organizers, the members of all levels of Venezuela's government. Venezuela is a very organized society, from tens of thousands of community councils up to 3,600 communes in Venezuela, an active militia organization, Venezuelans and municipal, statewide, very organized society, and their voices are being silenced. And so we also have a responsibility within activist groups and circles that we run in, and organizing that we do against war or against U.S. intervention, to make sure that Venezuela, and then campaigning to demand that U.S. hands off Venezuela remains central, especially in this coming period, because although, as I said, there's peace in the country and this coup attempt has been squashed and the people of Venezuela remain strong, we can only expect the U.S. to implement more tricks and more attempts. There's no sign that they're stopping.
Well, let me say that, and I've got a few more points before we run out of time. And one of them is, credit to the people of Venezuela, but credit also to the government of Nicolas Maduro. I think that, you can see how in this particular circumstance, they were really on top of things, and they also had like a much better setting in many ways to operate in than they did during previous crises, right? So you saw this really, what some people saw was a very unexpected and very clever move to go to the Supreme Court with a writ of amparo, which most people were not expecting. I mean, ordinarily you need to be the loser in the election to complain to the Supreme Court about it. But he went straight to the electoral section of the Supreme Court and said, we need to fully investigate this because, even though I won, my rights are being harmed here, and the people's of Venezuela's rights are being harmed. And so he got it into the court, which was a very smart thing to do to ensure the international validation of these elections. He got the military out there right at the top, saying we stand 100% with the government. There was a lot more international support, even though some people claimed, well, you've got these countries that were kind of wishy-washy. I mean, Chile, has a large Venezuelan, kind of refugee community or expat community there, and so they were very warbly. But Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil were there, and even if they kind of said, well, we're kind of holding off till the final results, that to me is 100% support, because that was exactly the strategy that the Venezuelan government was following too, which was to say, I won, but let's validate this. Let's get the complete results from the Supreme Court. So it seemed like they were operating on much more advantageous ground there. They used international support very well. They used the military. They had they got the people. They got their forces out into the streets to stop the violence and quell it immediately. They didn't let things fester, or it didn't, it wasn't like the Garimbas from a few years ago where things went on for a while. They tamped it all down. It was a much stronger reaction, and it was better for the country. And it shows just how much Maduro is learning and just how sophisticated this government is.
Definitely. I mean, they've had now over 25 years of practice of being under the thumb and target of the United States. And I think especially so when the sanctions were tightened and Venezuela, reached out to other sanctioned countries, got a lot of support from countries like Cuba, of course, but also countries like Iran, and started forming alliances with others that circumvented the United States. They've really strategically made some big gains against U.S. hegemony in Latin America, let alone being an example of a country standing for their independence and sovereignty and making economic gains. We talked earlier about the 90% loss in GDP, and there has been recovery, and Venezuela's economy now is expected to experience growth, and it's one of the only countries in the region to experience growth. And these are the numbers from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. So this isn't, government projection.
The inflation is down, and they're bouncing back, and he has support from all over the world. I mean, he was not that long ago in China talking to Xi Jinping, and they kind of think, well, I wonder what they talked about. I wonder what tips Xi Jinping gave him. I mean, it's he's kind of a very impressive figure, particularly because when he first started out, you kind of saw this guy who's like, well, Chavez picked him, and he's sort of a bus driver, and he's kind of still learning. But it's like at this point, he really knows what he's doing, and the whole country as just sort of you kind of feel like the revolution has deepened, and that things are going very, very well for them in a lot of ways, even if they're enduring all these sanctions.
Yeah, and I would really encourage folks, as part of organizing Venezuela Solidarity, we have formed a new North America-wide Venezuela Solidarity Network. And we're hoping to have this network to share the voices of people in Venezuela on the ground and work with others to organize, online or in-person events that tell the reality, but also to hopefully organize delegations in the future, because going to Venezuela, despite the State Department's warnings, which I believe still explicitly say this is not a place that you should travel, is an incredible experience to see that level of organization and kind of politics in action. Being part of Election Day, and even as you spoke to, the rallies and the size of rallies just shows the level of political engagement in Venezuela, which is very different than anything I've experienced in the United States or Canada when it comes to people caring about their communities and knowing that their vote, matters, and the continuation of the Bolivarian revolutionary process means actually dramatic change in their quality of life on the ground is something that you can only really feel when you get a chance to go there.
So if someone was interested in going, how would they go about doing that? Do you have some place that they can contact you?
I mean, I think the best way is to go with an organized delegation where you can meet with Venezuelans on the ground organizing in their communities. And so that means going with others. And I would say that folks can contact the Venezuela Solidarity Network, which is venezuelasolidaritynetwork.org. And we can put you in touch or let you know about upcoming trips or delegations, chances to go, and also ways to become active in changing U.S. policy, especially U.S., Canada, and we'll see who else joins them in this game to continue not recognizing the presidential election results in Venezuela and continue their campaign of sanctions and blockade. But we hope to work with others. Yeah, he's right there. It's true. We hope to work with people around the world to really confront this and to, organize our communities. I would also say, I know your program often talks about Palestine, and that's obviously a critical issue for many people becoming active in anti-war work and work for human rights in the United States and Canada at this moment. And we'll say that the Venezuelan government and President Nicolas Maduro stand wholly with the people of Palestine in their struggle against Israeli occupation. And the opposition is in fact openly pro-Zionist. And I think that's important to raise as well, as progressive people fall into this trap of thinking that the opposition stands for democracy or peace. We can point out too where their alliances lie when it comes to the brutal U.S.-Israeli genocide on Palestine.
Yeah, I've been kind of suspicious. I've been wondering myself whether when Gonzalez was active in a death squad in El Salvador, whether he had Israeli training or not, because these links kind of go all over the world.
They do, yeah. The international, the right wing and pro-Zionist forces are definitely very similar around the world and well connected, and we have to work really to connect our movements here and to build a more united and stronger Venezuela Solidarity movement against U.S. intervention in Latin America, and tie that directly to the work that so many people are doing day to day for our brothers and sisters in Palestine fighting against occupation.
Well, I'm glad we managed to have some reference to that before the end of the show, because I think it's very important to keep that center stage. We can't ignore everything else that's going on in the world. We can't, we can't put every program on Palestine, but it's nice to keep it, front and center and in people's minds, even when we're talking about Venezuela.
Well, thank you for that. And thanks for this interview. If people would like to be in touch or follow the work that I'm doing here in Vancouver, Canada, you can go to firethisTime.net, the Fire This Time Movement for Social Justice. And as I mentioned before, the Venezuela Solidarity Network, which we are a part of, and I'm a founding member of, along with many others around the U.S. and Canada, VenezuelaSolidarityNetwork.org.
Yeah, you've had some quite interesting webinars that have been ongoing. That you've held them regularly, and I think those are something that people would enjoy.
Definitely. Yeah. The whole archive of them is at firethisTime.net. And we're continuing through the Venezuela Solidarity Network to organize monthly webinars, or as we call them, online pickets, a chance to get updates from on the ground in Venezuela. And we will continue with those monthly and encourage people to follow and support those webinars. And thank you also for your support of the webinars over the years. Of course, many of them focused on the case of Alex Saab, a former political prisoner in the United States from Venezuela, who is now free in Venezuela.
I was just going to ask how he's doing.
He's doing well. He's head of a new section of the Venezuelan kind of investment branch of their government, working on getting international investment agreements going in Venezuela and helping develop the economy in that way. And of course, enjoying his time with his family. He was imprisoned basically for his work to circumvent U.S. sanctions and make deals for importing food and medicines and fuel into Venezuela through Iran, and was captured by the United States and held in prison in Miami, but eventually freed through the work of people around the world and the Venezuelan government, and is at home.
Yeah, imprisoned in Miami, captured in Cape Verde. Wow, that was a whole story too, and we've had programs on that as well. I just want to thank you again for being on the program. It's been so great talking with you. I hope to have you again sometime. Maybe you can come on with our regular Venezuela correspondent who's down in Caracas.
Yeah, anytime I'm available and definitely happy to discuss. Thanks to the grass is greener, Gary, Babette, and all of your audience.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye. Alison Bodine.